Here's the truth that spreads because it hurts. Being hardworking, honest, and kind doesn't make you powerful. It makes you easy. Easy to rely on, easy to drain, easy to replace. You weren't taught how to win. You were taught how to behave. Effort keeps you busy. Kindness keeps you quiet. Loyalty keeps you stuck. That's not an accident. That's design. You see it every day. You take on more. You fix what others break. You stay late because guilt whispers, "Be responsible." And while you're exhausted and invisible, decisions are made without you. The coworker who says less, commits less, and explains nothing somehow runs the room. They don't hustle for approval. They don't prove value. They assume it. And assumption is power. Your personal life isn't different. You give time. You give access. You reply fast. You show up every time. Slowly, your kindness stops looking like character and starts looking like permission. People don't respect what's always available. They consume it. The more you give, the less you matter. Then comes the final trick. You blame yourself. Not confident enough. Not tough enough. Wrong. You're not broken. You're trained. Your intelligence isn't missing. It's being extracted. Turned into fuel for people who learned one thing early. Power doesn't reward effort. It rewards leverage. And once this clicks, it spreads fast. Because everyone knows someone living this life. Before you dismiss this or call it too dark, understand who this comes from. Niccolo Machiavelli was not a monster. He wasn't obsessed with cruelty. He was obsessed with reality. He lived in a world where good intentions didn't protect you, and being morally pure without power meant being erased. What he saw, and what still makes people uncomfortable today, is simple. Human beings do not behave the way we wish they would. They behave the way incentives and power allow them to. Machiavelli did not teach people how to become evil. That's a lazy shortcut. He taught how not to be destroyed by people who have no problem lying, manipulating, or using you. He understood something most of us learn too late. Morality without awareness doesn't make you virtuous. It makes you exposed. You can be honest, loyal, and well-intentioned, and still lose everything if you don't understand how power actually works. This video is not about becoming heartless. It's not about betraying people or stepping on others to win. It's about survival. Psychological survival in a world that quietly rewards those who see clearly and punishes those who refuse to. We are not here to argue what should be fair. We are here to talk about what is real. Because reality doesn't respond to effort or purity. It responds to leverage, timing, and perception. If you've spent your life being the dependable one, the transparent one, the good one, and still feel overlooked, drained, or powerless, this is not a character flaw. It's a strategic blind spot. You were trained to seek approval instead of position, to chase understanding instead of control, and to mistake kindness for safety. If you've been good your whole life and still feel powerless, this is why. Law number 1, selective silence. That blind spot isn't an accident. It was installed. You were trained into a system that rewards your effort while draining your power. What comes next will rip that system apart into 9 laws. And once you see them, you'll realize the reason you've been losing isn't lack of intelligence or effort. It's because your energy has been quietly converted into leverage for others. And these 9 laws exist to reverse that, to stop the extraction and to turn you from fuel into force. You were taught that speaking up shows confidence, that explaining yourself proves intelligence, that being open builds trust. In reality, excessive talking does the opposite. The more you talk, the more you leak. The more you explain, the more you hand people the map to your mind. Talking is not neutral. Talking is disclosure. And disclosure in the wrong environment is a weakness. Think about how this plays out at work. In meetings, there's always one person who fills the silence. They jump in first. They clarify every detail. They justify their ideas before anyone even challenges them. They think they're helping. What they're actually doing is lowering their value. Meanwhile, there's another person in the room. Quiet. Watching. They wait. When they finally speak, it's short, measured, on point. Suddenly, everyone looks up. The room shifts. Authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from restraint. Silence makes people uncomfortable. And discomfort makes people reveal themselves. When you stop rushing to explain, others start talking to fill the gap. They ramble. They overcommit. They expose their insecurities and intentions without realizing it. While they're busy trying to be liked, you're gathering information. And information is leverage. You've felt this before. The person who intimidated you the most was never the loudest. It was the one who didn't react. The one who didn't need to prove anything. Their silence forced you to guess. And when people have to guess, they assume power. Silence creates pressure. Pressure reveals the truth. This doesn't mean becoming mute or distant. Selective silence is not withdrawal, it's precision. You speak when it moves the game forward. You stay quiet when words would only dilute your position. You stop narrating your intentions. You stop defending your choices before they're attacked. You stop explaining yourself to people who haven't earned access. Here's the line that changes everything. When you talk to be liked, you give up leverage. Respect grows in the space where your words are controlled. Silence is not weakness. Silence is timing. Silence is pacing. Silence is control of the rhythm. When people can't read you, they slow down. They become careful. They watch you instead of dismissing you. And that shift alone changes how the game is played. Law number 2, strategic amorality. Once you stop leaking power through words, you start seeing something uncomfortable. Silence doesn't just give you control, it exposes how emotional reactions have been running your decisions. And that's where the next shift begins. Betrayal hurts more when you don't understand it, not just the act itself, but the question that follows you everywhere. Why would they do this to me? You replay conversations. You look for signs you missed. You assume it happened because you were too trusting, too kind, too fair. That confusion is where most people lose twice. First to the betrayal, then to their own emotions. Here's the separation you were never taught to make. Personal morality is not the same thing as power analysis. You can be a good person and still think clearly about bad behavior. The moment you collapse those two, you blind yourself. You stop seeing moves. You stop seeing incentives. You start moralizing instead of strategizing. Look at how this plays out at work. A manager takes credit for your idea. You feel offended, angry, disrespected. You confront them emotionally, or worse, you shut down. Either way, you lose. Offense feels righteous, but it changes nothing. Now look at the same situation through a colder lens. A calm person doesn't ask, "How could they do this to me?" They ask, "Why did this work? And what does it give me information about?" One reaction burns energy. The other creates leverage. Think of reality like an engine. When a car doesn't start, a mechanic doesn't accuse the engine of being unfair or evil. They lift the hood. They look for the broken part. They fix it or replace it. Strategic amorality works the same way. When someone attacks you, manipulates you, or undermines you. Outrage is wasted motion. Analysis is progress. Who benefits? What do they want? Where is their dependency? Where is mine? This does not mean becoming unethical. It means refusing to let ethics cloud perception. You can still choose kindness, honesty, and restraint. But you choose them with open eyes, not blind faith. Because a good person with no understanding of power is not noble. They are predictable. And predictability is easy to exploit. Here's the line to remember. Offense is emotional luxury. Strategy is survival. The world does not pause to reward your hurt feelings. It moves. And if you don't move with clarity, it moves over you. So keep your values. Just don't let them make you naive. The goal is not to abandon morality. The goal is to stop letting morality be the reason you never see the knife coming. Law number 3. Never look untouchable. When you stop letting emotion drive your reactions, the game quietly shifts. You're no longer easy to move, and that change draws attention. One of the fastest ways to become a target is to look flawless. People don't say this out loud, but they feel it instantly. When you appear too capable, too controlled, too untouchable, something dark gets triggered in others. Envy, suspicion, the quiet desire to see you slip. And when you show nothing, share nothing, reveal nothing, that tension only grows. You don't look strong, you look threatening. Here's the paradox most people never learn. Being completely closed off doesn't protect you. It paints a target on your back. Humans don't trust perfection. They challenge it, they test it, they wait for it to crack. That's why people who seem too good often face subtle sabotage, gossip, or unnecessary resistance. Not because they did something wrong, but because they gave others nothing human to connect to. Watch how effective leaders handle this. The strongest ones don't pretend to be flawless. They casually mention a small mistake from the past. They laugh about being bad with technology. They admit they once misjudged a situation. The team relaxes. Guards drop. Trust forms. Not because the leader is weak, but because the weakness feels safe. It's controlled. It costs nothing. This is the law of controlled vulnerability. You reveal a harmless flaw to protect your real strengths. You offer a scratch, not your throat. You let people see something minor, so they stop digging for something major. While they bond over what you chose to show, they stay blind to what actually matters. Your plans, your leverage, your true capacity. People who misunderstand this think it's fake. It's not. It's awareness. You're not lying about who you are. You're choosing what part of yourself enters the room. Just like you don't hand a stranger your bank password, you don't hand everyone your psychological core. Here's the line to remember. Never show your throat. Show a scratch. When people feel safe around you, they stop trying to cut you down. And that gives you space to move, build, and grow without constant resistance. This isn't deception. It's perception management. And in a world that reacts to what it sees, managing perception is how you stay protected while staying powerful. Law number 4. Be the mirror. Let them talk. Once you stop looking like a threat, something subtle changes. People lower their guard, and in that moment, they don't want to see you. They want to see themselves. The harder you try to impress people, the less they notice you. That's the trap. You walk into conversations armed with ideas, stories, achievements, hoping something will land. Instead, eyes drift. Phones come out. The room moves on. Meanwhile, the person who barely speaks, who mostly listens, somehow walks away, labeled as sharp, thoughtful, even intimidating. That's not an accident. It's psychology. Here's the truth most people miss. Humans are not drawn to brilliance. They are drawn to themselves. Everyone is the main character in their own story, and everyone is desperately looking for a mirror that confirms it. When you try to shine too brightly, you compete with their identity. When you reflect on them, you validate it. And validation creates attachment. This is why the quiet listener often controls the room. They ask a simple question. They repeat someone's words back with slightly more clarity. They nod at the right moments. They mirror tone, pace, and emotion. The other person walks away thinking, "That was a great conversation," without realizing they did most of the talking. They don't remember what the listener said. They remember how they felt, seen, understood, important. The technique is simple, but uncomfortable at first. Use their words instead of yours. Match their emotional temperature. If they're excited, don't cool it down. If they're frustrated, don't fix it immediately. Reflecting on it. When you mirror someone, they stop evaluating you and start projecting onto you. While they're bonding with their own reflection, you're learning their values, insecurities, and motivations without resistance. This isn't fake empathy. It's strategic awareness. You're not manipulating emotions out of malice. You're choosing not to compete for attention in a game you don't need to win, because once someone feels understood by you, influence follows naturally. Remember this line: people don't bond with brilliance. They bond with reflection. When they fall in love with how they feel around you, they give you access. And when you have access, you don't need to force control. You already have it. Law number 5. Want less, win more. When people start feeling seen and safe around you, the next test is whether you still give away control by needing their approval. The moment you want something too badly, you hand over control. Not symbolically, practically. Desire creates pressure, and pressure makes you predictable. People can feel it on you before you ever say a word. They hear it in your voice. They see it in how fast you reply, how much you compromise, how afraid you are to rock the boat. The more you need the outcome, the easier you are to manage. You see this everywhere. At work, the employee who is terrified of losing their job becomes the easiest one to exploit. They stay late without being asked. They accept disrespect wrapped as feedback. They say yes when they should pause. Management doesn't even have to threaten them. Fear does the job for free. Meanwhile, the person who can quietly walk away operates differently. They negotiate calmly. They set boundaries. They are listened to, not because they're aggressive, but because they're not desperate. The same dynamic plays out in relationships. The one who needs the relationship more is always the one adjusting, apologizing, and tolerating behavior they swore they never would. Want turns into leverage for the other person. And once that imbalance is felt, respect starts to erode. This is why outcome independence is not detachment. It's power. You still care. You still try. But you remove the panic from the equation. One simple mental exercise changes everything. Sit with the worst-case scenario. Losing the job, losing the deal, losing the relationship. Play it all the way through. You feel the discomfort, then you notice something important. You survive. Your identity doesn't collapse. Your future doesn't end. That realization weakens fear at the root. When fear loosens its grip, your behavior changes automatically. Your voice steadies. Your decisions slow down. You stop chasing. And paradoxically, that's when people lean in. Because the one who doesn't need the outcome is the one who controls the frame. Remember this line? The one who can walk away owns the room. Not because they want less, but because they are no longer owned by the fear of loss. You don't have to abandon ambition. You don't have to stop caring. You only have to let go of the idea that losing is fatal. Once you do that, you stop being controlled by what you want, and you start being respected for what you're willing to live without. Law number 6. No enemy, no growth. Freedom feels powerful at first, but without friction, that power slowly turns into comfort, and comfort is where growth dies. Peace feels good, and that's exactly why it makes you weaker. When nothing challenges you, your edge dulls without you noticing. You stop sharpening your thinking. You stop questioning your habits. You confuse comfort with stability and call it success. That's how stagnation sneaks in. Quietly, politely, deadly. Look at what happens when there's no opposition. You start repeating the same ideas. You stop preparing as hard. You assume you're good enough because no one is pushing back. That's when mistakes multiply. Not because you became stupid, but because you stopped evolving. Comfort doesn't preserve intelligence, it erodes it. Now contrast that with having a real opponent, not a hater online, not random noise, a true rival, someone who forces you to think faster, move cleaner, and question your assumptions. Suddenly, you're alert. You train harder. You notice your weaknesses because they get exposed. Every interaction becomes feedback. Every loss becomes information. You don't get lazy when someone is watching closely. This is why friction matters. Fire doesn't come from calm air. It comes from resistance. Pressure creates heat. Heat creates transformation. Without friction, nothing ignites. Without opposition, there is no growth. The mind works the same way. When life gets too smooth, intelligence starts decaying. Most people make the same mistake. They try to eliminate enemies. They avoid conflict. They want everyone to like them. That instinct feels safe, but it slowly robs them of momentum. Avoiding friction doesn't protect you. It weakens you. You don't need chaos, but you do need resistance. Here's the shift. Don't fear the enemy. Don't obsess over them either. Use them. Let their presence force you to refine yourself. Let their pressure expose where you're sloppy. Let their doubt sharpen your discipline. The goal isn't endless war. The goal is evolution. Remember this line: comfort is intelligence decay. If you want to grow, you don't look for peace first. You look for a challenge. Don't avoid enemies. Choose enemies worthy of your potential. The right opponent doesn't destroy you. They forge you. Law number 7. Stop being yourself. Pressure sharpens you, but pressure also exposes who you are under stress. That's why the next edge is learning how to shape the version of yourself that shows up in the fight. Just be yourself sounds comforting. It also quietly ruins opportunities. Not because authenticity is wrong, but because unfiltered authenticity ignores context. You've felt this before. You spoke the same way in a high-stakes meeting as you do with close friends. You reacted emotionally and called it honesty. You told yourself, "That's just who I am," while watching doors slowly close. Here's the truth people avoid. You are not one fixed personality. You never were. You are different with your boss than with your family. Different with your partner than with a competitor. Different in private than under pressure. Pretending otherwise isn't integrity. It's denial. The problem isn't having many versions of yourself. The problem is letting the wrong one show up at the wrong time. Think of personality like a toolbox. You wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw. You wouldn't use a screwdriver to break concrete. Each tool has a moment. Each role requires calibration. Yet people walk into every situation with the same emotional setting and call it being real. That's not real. That's careless. High-level operators understand this instinctively. In a negotiation, they become calm and precise. In leadership, they project certainty. In close relationships, they soften. None of this is fake. It's deliberate. They are not lying about who they are. They are choosing which part of themselves serves the situation best. This is where many people resist. They fear adaptation means manipulation. It doesn't. Manipulation hides intent to harm. Calibration hides nothing. It simply respects reality. You're not deceiving others. You're refusing to sabotage yourself by oversharing emotion or impulse where it doesn't belong. Remember this line: authenticity without control is just chaos. Chaos feels honest, but it destroys trust, authority, and momentum. Control doesn't erase your identity. It protects it. The goal is not to become someone else. The goal is to stop letting raw emotion dictate your outcomes. You don't lose yourself by adapting. You lose opportunities by refusing to. Smart adaptation isn't deception. It's survival with self-respect intact. Law number 8. Blind trust kills. The deepest wounds don't come from enemies. They come from people you trusted. That's because trust, when given blindly, hands someone access to your blind spots. You weren't hurt because you believed in people. You were hurt because you believed without verification. And there is a critical difference. Suspicion is not paranoia. Paranoia is fear without evidence. Suspicion is awareness with discipline. It's the ability to stay warm without falling asleep. Most people reject suspicion because it feels negative. They prefer optimism. They prefer assuming good intentions. That preference feels moral, but it's also expensive. Look at how damage actually happens. Someone promises support. Someone says they have your back. Someone talks about loyalty, teamwork, and shared goals. You relax, you lean in, then pressure hits, and suddenly their behavior changes. The words stay soft. The actions disappear. This is where people get broken. Not because they were lied to once, but because they ignored the mismatch for too long. Words are cheap. They cost nothing to produce and everything to believe. Actions, on the other hand, require effort, consistency, and risk. That's why they're rare. That's also why they're the only reliable signal. A person can say anything, but they can't fake patterns over time. Watch what people do when it costs them something. Watch how they behave when there's no audience. That's the truth. Necessary suspicion doesn't mean treating everyone like an enemy. It means delaying trust until behavior earns it. It means testing small before relying on big. Giving limited responsibility and observing how it's handled. Listening to promises, but placing your weight on proof. This approach doesn't make you cold. It makes you intact. Here's the line that matters. Words are bait. Actions are truth. The people who hurt you most weren't powerful. They were unexamined. You assumed alignment where there was only convenience. So choose surprises wisely. It's far better to be pleasantly surprised by loyalty than emotionally shattered by betrayal. Suspicion doesn't isolate you. It filters your circle. And once you start filtering, trust stops being a liability and becomes a strength. Law number 9. Not harmless. Being harmless feels virtuous. It also makes you easy to step on. You were taught that kindness means softness, that anger is dangerous, that power corrupts. So you learn to shrink yourself, to swallow instincts, to avoid confrontation. And over time, people noticed. Not consciously, instinctively. They sensed there was no consequence for crossing you. Here's the hard truth. A harmless person is not a good person. They're just incapable of stopping harm. Goodness requires capacity. If you cannot say no, cannot push back, cannot impose consequences, your kindness isn't a choice. It's a limitation. And limitations invite exploitation. Think about someone who knows they are capable of cruelty. They understand manipulation. They recognize violence, dominance, and control inside themselves. But they don't act on it blindly. They restrain it. That restraint is strength. Compare that to someone who avoids conflict because they're afraid. One is choosing peace, the other is hiding inside it. The difference matters. This is what it means to integrate your shadow. You stop pretending you're harmless. You admit to yourself that you have teeth. You have anger. You have the ability to destroy things if pushed far enough. And instead of denying that, you bring it under control. You don't unleash it. You harness it. People who repress their darker impulses don't become pure. They become passive-aggressive, resentful, bitter. Their shadow leaks out sideways in sabotage, self-doubt, and quiet self-hatred. That's not morality. That's decay. Integration is healthier than repression. Control is stronger than denial. When others sense that you could be dangerous but choose not to be, something shifts. Boundaries hold. Respect appears without explanation. You don't need to threaten. You don't need to raise your voice. The presence alone does the work. Because power that is controlled is felt. Remember this line: peaceful by choice, not by weakness. That is the difference between a victim and a grounded person, between someone who gets used and someone who decides. Integrating your shadow doesn't turn you into a villain. It turns you into someone whole, and wholeness is freedom. When you no longer fear your own darkness, you stop being afraid of the darkness in others. That's when you become truly untouchable. Awakening doesn't arrive as a moment of noise or triumph. It settles quietly, changing how steady you are, how little you need to explain, and how differently you move through situations that once ran you. Awakening comes with a cost no one romanticizes: distance. Not because you became arrogant, but because you stopped pretending. Conversations feel thinner. Old dynamics crack. People who once felt comfortable around you start to feel uneasy. They say it softly, or they say it sharp, but the message is the same. You've changed. What they mean is simpler. You no longer play the role that made them feel safe. This is the part that hurts if you're not prepared for it. You will lose access to rooms you used to enter easily. Some friendships will fade without a fight. Not because you did something wrong, but because clarity disrupts comfort. When you stop over-explaining, stop over-giving, stop reacting on command, the illusion breaks. And illusions don't forgive the people who see through them. Let this be clear. You didn't become cold. You became awake. Coldness is an emotional shutdown. Awareness is precision. You still care, but you no longer bleed. You still listen, but you don't surrender yourself in the process. That difference is uncomfortable for people who benefited from your confusion. Loneliness is not the punishment for growth. It's the transition. The space between who you were trained to be and who you are choosing to become. In that space, noise falls away. Approval loses its grip. You start hearing your own thinking again, and that's when something rare happens. Respect replaces tolerance. Fewer connections, but cleaner ones. Fewer voices, but clearer signals. This video is not an invitation for everyone. Most people don't want to wake up. They want relief without responsibility. They want insight without consequence. That's not what this is. This is for the few who are tired of being used, tired of being confused, tired of living at half strength just to stay liked. If you're still here, it's because something in you recognized the truth beneath the discomfort. The path forward isn't louder. It's sharper, and it doesn't ask for permission. You won't be surrounded by everyone anymore, but you'll finally be surrounded by yourself. And that's where real power begins.